Martin Luther King Jr. was an important leader of the civil rights movement in the United States. He changed race relations by supporting equal rights for African Americans. A monument in Washington, D.C. honors him and his movement. He is also remembered with his own holiday on the third Monday of every January. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist clergyman. He supported freedom and justice for all Americans by leading peaceful protests. In the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans did not have the same rights as white Americans. This was called racism. There were separate schools and even drinking fountains. This was called segregation. In American southern states like Mississippi, African Americans were sometimes stopped from voting.
Mississippi is a state that has consistently resisted any move to rid itself of racism.
There were defeats in carrying out peaceful protests against racism and segregation. On Bloody Sunday in 1965, protesters for African American voting rights were beaten. John Lewis led the march then. Today, he is a congressman in Washington, D.C.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses. I thought I was going to die.
Historians say the nonviolent movement that Martin Luther King Jr. led was important. It gave all Americans freedom and equal rights under the law.
President Obama, Mrs. Obama, Presidents Carter and Clinton, Congressman Lewis, Ambassador Young, to my brother Martin III, Dexter Scott King, and to my entire family. I was 5 months old when my father delivered his I Have a Dream speech, and I probably was somewhere crawling on the floor or taking a nap after having a meal. But today is a glorious day because on this program today we have witnessed a manifestation of the beloved community. And we thank everyone for their presence here today. Today we have been honored to have 3 presidents of the United States. 50 years ago, the president did not attend. Today we are honored to have many women in the planning and mobilization of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And 50 years ago, there was not a single woman on the program. Today, we are honored to have not just one young person, but several young people on the program today. It is certainly a tribute to the work and the legacy of so many people that have gone on before us. 50 years ago today, in the symbolic shadow of this great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, my father, the great liberator, stood in this very spot and declared to this nation his dream to let freedom ring for all people who were being manacled by a system of segregation and discrimination. 50 years ago, he commissioned us to go back to our various cities, towns, hamlets, states, and villages, and let freedom ring. The reverberation of the sound of that freedom message has amplified and echoed since 1963, through the decades, and coast to coast throughout this nation and even around the world, and has summoned us once again back to these hallowed grounds to send out a clarion call to let freedom ring. Since that time, as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act in 1968, we have witnessed great strides toward freedom for all, regardless of race, color, gender, religion, national origin, disability, class, or sexual orientation. 50 years later, in this year of Jubilee, we're standing once again in the shadow of that great emancipator, having been summoned to these hallowed grounds to reverberate the message of that great liberator. For there's a remnant from 1963, Congressman Lewis, Ambassador Young, that still remains, who has come to bequeath that message of freedom to a new generation of people who must now carry that message in their time, in their communities, amongst their tribes, and amongst their nations of the world. We must keep the sound and the message of freedom and justice going. It was my mother, as has been said previously, Coretta Scott King, who in fact 30 years ago assembled a coalition of conscience that started us on this whole path of remembering the anniversary of the March on Washington. She reminded us that struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And so we come once again to let freedom ring, because if freedom stops ringing, then the sound will disappear and the atmosphere will be charged with something else. 50 years later, we come once again to this special landing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to reflect, to renew, and to rejuvenate for the continued struggle of freedom and justice. For today, 50 years later, my friends, we are still crippled by practices and policies steeped in racial pride, hatred, and hostility, some of which have us standing our ground rather than finding common ground. We are still chained by economic disparities, income and class inequalities, and conditions of poverty for many of God's children around this nation and the world. We're still bound by a cycle of civil unrest and inherent social biases in our nation and world that oftentimes degenerates into violence and destruction, especially against women and children. We're at this landing, and now we must break the cycle. The prophet King spoke the vision. He made it plain, and we must run with it in this generation. His prophetic vision and magnificent dream described the yearning of people all over the world to have the freedom to prosper in life, which is the right to pursue one's aspirations, purpose, dreams, well-being, without oppressive, depressive, repressive practices, behaviors, laws, and conditions that diminish one's dignity and that denies one life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The freedom to participate in government, which is the right to have a voice and a say in how you are represented, regulated, and governed without threats of tyranny, disenfranchisement, exclusionary tactics and behaviors, and to have freedom to peacefully coexist, which is the right to be respected in one's selfhood, individuality, and uniqueness without fear of attack, assault, or abuse. In 1967, my father asked a poignant and critical question: where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And we say with a resounding voice, no to chaos and yes to community. If we're going to rid ourselves of the chaos, then we must make a necessary shift. Nothing is more tragic than for us to fail to achieve new attitudes and new mental outlooks. We have a tremendous and unprecedented opportunity to reset the very means by which we live, work, and enjoy our lives. If we're going to continue the struggle of freedom and create true community, then we will have to be relentless in exposing, confronting, and ridding ourselves of the mindset of pride and greed and selfishness and hate and lust and fear and idleness and lack of purpose and lack of love, as my brother said, for our neighbor. We must seize this moment, the dawning of a new day, the emergence of a new generation who is postured to change the world through collaborative power facilitated by unconditional love. And as I close, I call upon a brother by the name of Nehemiah, who was also in the midst of rebuilding a community. And in the midst of rebuilding a community, he brought the leaders and the rulers and the rest of the people together. And he told them that the work is great and large, and we are widely separated one from another on the wall. But when you hear the sound of the trumpet, and might I say, when you hear the sound of the bell today, come to that spot and our God will fight with us. And so today we're gonna let freedom ring all across this nation. We're gonna let freedom ring everywhere we go. If freedom is going to ring in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, in Florida, then we must reach across the table, feed each other, and let freedom ring.